the stage for the first talk in this section Divya Manian, who's a web opener at Opera Software. She'll be talking to you about some hot CSS layout topics that you should know about. Thank you and welcome, Divya.
Okay. Oh, my mic's on. Okay, so today I was supposed to be talking about 5 layout stuff that you can look forward to in the future with CSS, but I just added one more today, so you'll have a bonus layout proposal to look at for today. So, okay, so before I go forward, I'd just like to briefly introduce myself. So my name is Divya Manian, and I work as a web opener for Opera Software. How many of you know what that means? People working for Opera don't count. So what that means is that I would contact developers like you, and if a site doesn't work in Opera, tell you why it doesn't work, and maybe most likely it's because it's using some 2003 browser sniffing code, and that has not been updated at all, and fix it so that it works on all browsers, including Opera. And when I'm not working, I contribute to HTML5 boilerplate, along with Paul Irish, and 3 other people and several others who have contributed to it. How many of you use it? HTML5 boilerplate? Few people. It's not bad. Cool. And I'm also a member of the CSS working group, which is why I tend to hear some gossip about the layout proposals, and which is why I can give this talk today. And when I'm not doing stuff, I'm also apparently the arsonist of the semantic web, because I recently wrote a post saying you should not be too concerned about semantics, and then I immediately was painted as a villain. You can go and read about it later on. And I'm also, sometimes I write on my own website, which is at nimbupani.com, and I'm on Twitter at Divya. So if there's any questions that I'm unable to answer during this talk, please ask me on Twitter. OK, so today what I'd like to cover is first go through the current state of layout, what you can do with CSS as it exists right now, and then what you can look forward to in the near future, maybe a year or 2 in the future, and then what to do in the meanwhile. So let's look at what we have right now. So the way we would do our layout design today would be to use one of these techniques, like floats. Everyone knows how to use floats. That's the default way of doing layouts. And then sometimes you use positioning, absolute positioning, relative positioning to do your layouts. And some other times, this is like a lifesaver when you use inline blocks. If you have a list of thumbnails, et cetera, you'd be using inline blocks. And then maybe you'd want to do some tweaking for vertically aligning stuff related to some other content, so you'd be using negative margins. And then you'd use worst case, if you want to do vertical centering, you have no choice but to use table cell or display table. And then those are the things that you do. But the problem is most of these techniques that we use right now are created like 10 years ago, when we did not have the complex layouts that we are creating today on the web. So these techniques do not exactly map to what we want right now. So for example, floats require clearing. And then none of these techniques that we have are content agnostic, so which means you can't have content in the footer be displayed at the, before the content in a particular section. Those things is impossible. And then, as I mentioned, floats do require clearing. And very recently, we had a proper clear fix that works without any edge case bugs. And that kind of took too long to get to. Then we also, vertical centering is almost impossible with just limited markup. For vertical centering, you need like 2 or 3 elements, and then display table, table cell. And even then, it doesn't work as well as you want it to. And then always, your content breaks on small screens or different kinds of screens. So when you have floats and you have a smaller screen or a wider screen, it doesn't exactly stretch the way you want it to. So you have to do adjustments, use media queries, et cetera. So we have a few layout proposals that try to address some of these issues. And there are like 6 of them that I'd like to talk about today. So the first one being the generated content for paged media, then multiple columns, which is almost available in all browsers today, then regions, exclusions, grid, and flexbox. So most of these are only available in some sort of snapshot builds or lab builds or preview builds and not in stable browsers, except for multiple columns. So it's something that you can look forward to and experiment with, but not something that you can apply right now. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the generated content for paged media. So well, before I go forward, this is where the spec resides. So if you want to read about it, I would encourage you to read it. And then the way you would specify it is using something like this code. So what it does is that it makes the content of element be paged over, and have controls to control the paging. So a demo of this would be, let me just, something like this. So for example, this is a slideshow, and I can do paged content. And the way it works is, if I look this, each of these slides, I have overflow X and overflow Y. Can you see this? Whoa, let me try to expand. This is how you set it. I have an O prefix, and then I have paged X controls, which is why you see the paged controls rendering below that particular area, and then you can page through each of this content. So, oops. The first media query, which is @media_paged, indicates that this browser supports paged media, and which is why you can put all the selectors that would apply if you're using paged media under this media query. And then you then indicate which element needs to be paged using the overflow, and then you say overflow style, paged X, or paged X controls. Now, this property was previously called overflow and not overflow style, and it was changed yesterday. So I had to update my slides yesterday. So you know how fresh and new these specs are and how much of work in progress they are. So you can also use break before, break after, and break inside to specify if the content needs to be broken, how content breaks between pages. So for example, you may have your headings, and you don't want your headings to display at the last line of a page. You want the headings and the content that follows to be together. So you would say, for example, h1, h2 break after a void, so that all the headings will be, if it has content below a heading, it will come in the next page, instead of being displayed as the last line on a page. So there's also an API associated with it. So the first is a page change event on page change, which will be fired every time a page is changed. And then current page is something that you can set, which will tell you to update a page. So you can say current page ++ to update a page to the next one or the previous page. And then page count is a read-only property that tells you the number of pages that exist in that particular element that is paged. So in terms of browser support, there is an Opera Labs build, and there is more information about this at this URL. And then Howcom is working, well, he's the one who's writing the spec for this, and so he has more information on his website. So next is multiple columns. This is pretty simple. How many of you have used multiple columns already? OK, cool. And so in terms of multiple columns, the spec resides here. And the way you would trigger multiple columns is on an element is using a selector. You would just specify column width or column count. And then column width would, it would have the width of each column, but then you can have as many columns as that particular element's width allows for. And then column count, you only specify the number of columns, and then the width can be automatically adjusted. So there is, again, you can use the same break before and break after to control the content, how they lay out within columns. So if you have headings, again, use break after a void so that the headings and the content are in the next column and not as the last line of the column. Then you have a column span all, which will let you span across columns. For example, here in this image, you can see that the text that starts with suspend, say, blah, blah, is spanning 3 columns, but the content before and after are in 3 multiple columns. So this is easy if you want have text render in this manner, like in newspapers. There is also a column fill that tells the browser how to fill a column. And the default is to balance, which means that the content will be filled so that all the columns are not, are filled and they're not empty. But if you choose, for example, let's look at how it would look like. So for example, we have 4 columns, and all of them are filled. But if you use column fill auto, then it'll just make sure each column is filled before it goes to the other column. So the last column in this example is empty. So in terms of browser support, it's pretty good. And we have all these browsers already supporting it. It's almost as good ready to go for production use. And especially because when multiple column is not supported, it just falls back to a single column rendering, which is not bad at all for readability for users. And then we have a new spec called regions. And regions is, how many of you have used InDesign? OK, few of you. So in InDesign, you may have seen this feature where you have different boxes, and you can have content from one box flow to the other by connecting the 2 boxes together. And then you can place the boxes as far apart as you like, but the content will still flow through the box. And that's the kind of effect, or that's the kind of feature that regions brings to the web. So you can have multiple boxes, and you can have content flowing through all these multiple boxes in the document flow order. And the spec, as I said, the URL is there. So the way it works is, first you need to have a uniquely identifiable named flow. So for example, in here, the named flow is called article_flow. And then we have to select which elements the content of those elements need to go into that flow. So for example, in this, what I have here, I say that an article with a class name news, the contents of that element needs to be part of this flow. And then I need to create regions through which this content will actually flow. And that I create by saying, choosing a multiple list of selectors, and then I set the property flow from, and say, and put the same named flow, which means that the content that is in that particular flow will flow through these elements. And now each element then becomes a region. So as I mentioned, article_flow is the named flow. And then all these selectors that are using the flow from property, because they now become regions, they need to be block containers. And they also establish new block formatting contexts and stacking contexts. So it means that if you have content that is flowing through a region that is absolutely positioned, it means that it will be absolutely positioned relative to that particular region and not to the viewport. So that's something you need to keep in mind. You can also style the elements, the selectors that pass through a particular region. So for example, if you have a region that has an ID main, and then you have an element that has an ID article flowing through it, then you can say that you can choose to set the color or the width or the font size of that particular element that's flowing through it. So there is only a limited set of properties, and it's specified in the spec. There is also an API, which is called, there are 2 functions, 2 interfaces that is provided, get named flow, and then there is an event called region layout update. So when you have the get named flow API, what it shows you is that it has 3 properties. Well, at least there is the first property, the overflow, which indicates whether it's a Boolean property. It indicates whether the content is of that particular flow fills all the regions, or does it overflow. So you can say overflow is either set to true or false. And then the content nodes returns all the content nodes that form part of that named flow. So you may have content with, like, say, 10 paragraph elements, and all those 10 paragraph elements will be returned when you query with content nodes. And then the get regions by content node function would, and then what it does is that it will return all the regions through which a particular content node flows through. So for example, if you have a long paragraph, it could flow through 3 different boxes, so 3 different regions. So, and if you use get regions by content node for that particular paragraph element, then it will return all the 3 elements through which it passes through. And then the event is, there's an event. So every time a region layout is updated, an event is triggered, and you can use that to do whatever manipulations that you would like to do. In terms of browser support, we have Chrome 15 plus, and then Safari 6 plus, and IE 10 plus. But the spec is still changing, so most of these builds that are out may already be out of date, and some of them don't even support the API yet. So you can only use the properties that are in the spec. And then I'll come to exclusions, which is like something that really created a flutter when it first came about. So the spec is right here, and as you can see, this image is an example of an exclusion in action. The thing to note is that on the left side, the text is wrapping around the rocks. And this is something that you would see in a print magazine, but it's not something that you would see on the web before. But now with this spec, if it is implemented, you would start to use it in websites and web pages. And the way to do that is that first you need to define an exclusion element. And now an exclusion element is one whose the outside dimensions set the wrapping for the inline text that is outside of it. And the way you define it is using a property called wrap flow, and make sure it's not set to auto. And then you'll have an exclusion area. For example, all the area that is outside the scraggy rocks, that is the exclusion area. And it defines the wrapping for the inline content that is outside of that particular exclusion element. And wrap flow can have these values. And again, these values may change. Right now, these are the values that it can have. And then wrap flow auto is the default value that it will possess, which is exactly like how it would appear when you have no exclusion support at all. So for example, in this particular image, the text that says donut meters, etc., that box is absolutely positioned, and in the center of the parent selector. And then if you notice, the inline text is flowing without concern of the absolutely positioned element. It's just layered on top. And then the inline text, there is nothing happening. There's no interaction between the absolutely positioned element and the inline text behind it. But if you use wrap flow right, what happens then is that the inline text starts wrapping the absolutely positioned element. And then because you say wrap flow right, it means it only wrap on the right side. And if you say wrap flow left, it'll wrap only on the left. And then there's a wrap flow both, which means it'll wrap on both sides. And there's also a property called maximum, which means it'll wrap on the side that has maximum space available for wrapping. And then you can also do wrap flow clear, which means it won't wrap on the sides, but just flow above and below it. Now, while you're doing that, there's also ways to set the space between the inline text outside of the exclusion element and the boundary of the exclusion element. So that is set using the wrap margin. So you use that to offset the inline content outside of the exclusion element. And there's also wrap padding, because now you can also offset the inline content inside the exclusion element from the boundary of it. And you do that by using this wrap padding property. So this is an example. For example, the dashed red circle indicates the boundary of that exclusion element. And the space between the inline text outside of that boundary and the red dashed boundary is the wrap margin. That's what you use to set that space. And then the space between the blue text and the red dashed boundary is the space that you would set using the wrap padding property. So there is what I have not mentioned so far is that right now, what I've mentioned so far does not give the custom shapes that you saw in that example. And the way you would do that is using shape property, the shape outside and shape inside. So these two properties are what you would use to set those exotic custom shapes that make exclusions so desirable. So there are three ways you can do it. So first is you'll use SVG-like syntax to set the shape. So you can use circle 50% and 50%, 50% to do that. And then the shape outside property would determine the wrap area or the wrapping for the inline content outside of the exclusion element. And then the shape inside would determine that for the inline content inside of that exclusion element. So as I mentioned, the shape inside and shape outside properties can take SVG-like syntax, and it can also take SVG itself, and you can also take an image that you can use to determine the shape of the wrapping area. So here's an example of how those shapes work. So the star what you see outside is determined by the shape outside property, and the circle that is inside. So the text inside the circle is the text inside the exclusion element, and that is determined by the shape inside property. So there's another proposal out there called grid, because everyone loves grids. And we have had several grid frameworks out there, and so there's a proposal to standardize a way to specify grids in CSS. And the spec resides here, and this is an example of how a grid would look like. And this is straight off the spec, so pardon the lack of finesse in this illustration. And if you notice, you see there's a fixed height row at the top, and there's a fixed height row at the bottom, and there's a fluid row in the middle. And same is the case for the column. There are two columns, and there's one column that's fixed width, and then there's a column that is fluid. And this is all set using the grid, the syntax and the properties in the grid proposal. So the way you would trigger a grid layout is that on the parent selector where you want that grid to occur, you would use display property and set it to grid. So, and then you would say how many columns and how many rows you want. And the way, well, grid columns, very easy to understand. But note that you specify the width of the columns that you want. So you say auto, which means the first column is going to be occupying as much space as the content allows. And then you have the min-max function. I'm not going to go into that, but it's in the CSS values spec. So it would, it's a way to set fluid width that is controllable by you. And same with the grid rows, because we have 3 rows. We have auto for the first row, and then fluid width for the fluid height for the second one, and then the auto for the last row as well. And you also can use the content need not be in document order. So you can say any selector can go into any part of the grid. And you do that by saying, that particular element, use a selector for that element, and then you say it belongs to this grid row and this column. So in this example, an element with ID title belongs to the first row and the first column, and an ID score belongs to the third row and the first column. Also, another interesting part of the grid layout proposal is that there's a template that you could use now. So you can say grid template and then specify a bunch of text strings. So each string refers to a row, and each character in the string refers to a column. And so when you want to put an element into a particular cell, what you would do is you would just refer to that particular character. So for example, in this case, I'll say the title, the element with ID title will occupy a cell that has the character T. Because in the grid template, that the T is the first row and the first column. And then, for example, if I want the score to occupy grid cell S, then that would be the second row and the first column. So this is a very easy way of controlling where your content goes and how you're designing your layouts, because it's not following the document flow, or you don't have to adjust for it. You can put content, throw your elements wherever that you want them to reside. Let's see. So it's also an easy way to span grid rows and grid columns with grid row span and grid row column span. It's all pretty trivial. And in terms of browser support, only IE10 has a build that is out with that. But I think, again, this layout, the spec is going to change. So what you have right now would be something that's an older implementation of the spec. Finally, I come to Flexbox. How many of you use Flexbox in your? Oh, you already do? It's too bad because it's changed, So you have to update your whatever you've done, your websites. And the way, well, I don't want to go too deep into this because it's still in a flux, I think. And so the box model, Flexbox model, will just help you distribute boxes in as many ways as possible in the available space. And the spec is right here. So one of the things that it helps accomplish is a layout like this, which is almost impossible with the current set of tools that we have. And this is, it also scales among different screens. And the way you would do this, typically with the tools we have, we need to have extra markup to create this kind of layout. But with Flexbox, all you need to do is that where the parent selector where you want this Flexbox to appear, you'll just use a display property and set it to Flexbox, contrary to what you used to do before, which is box, I think. And then you would have a Flexpack property that would you would use to align the Flexbox items horizontally at the center, and then Flex Align to make sure it's aligned vertically at the center, and then you would specify the width and height. So this is just one, 5 lines of CSS instead of what you would typically do with like 4 or 5 elements and then some 20 rules with 5 lines of CSS each. So a Flexbox item is something that needs to be a block level child of that particular parent selector. In this case, it was the body. But there are other items that can be a Flexbox item, and it's in the spec. And there's a whole algorithm that I've not managed to read through. If you want to, you can, about how Flexbox works in detail. So before I summarize, you can trigger different kinds of layout modes with different properties. So the page media, generated content for page media is triggered with the overflow style property. And then the multiple columns with column width or column count. And it only applies on block, inline, or table cell elements, which means you can't apply this on a grid, or you can't apply this on a Flexbox. I don't even understand why you would want to, but just to note. And then regions, you would trigger it with the flow from property, and then a named flow that it would use to render content from. And then exclusions would be triggered using a wrap flow property, which is not set to auto, and on block level elements. And Flexbox, you trigger using a display property set to Flexbox or inline Flexbox. And so if you're trying to mix and match, a region can be an exclusion, and it can also have multiple columns. So an exclusion, a box this is mutually exclusive. So a box can only be a region or a grid or a Flexbox, and not all 3 or so. And then a Flexbox or a grid cannot be an exclusion, nor can it have multiple columns. So that's sort of understandable. So I sort of made a table so that you can see how each of these work. So multiple columns can be used with almost all of this, except for grid and Flexbox, and etc. So what you need to be aware, though, like I mentioned, the spec is completely changing all the time. So it's like 2 weeks from now, what I say will no longer be valid for most of the things that I just talked about. And so the syntaxes are also changing. So you need to be careful if you're using this in production sites that make sure that you're using the right syntax. And so most likely, most of these drafts that I just mentioned are not ready for production at all, and won't be, I think, for a year or 2. So feel free to use it in your personal experiments that you're doing, and try to experiment with it in your builds, but just not use it for live sites that are commercial sites you're developing. And even if you're using it in personal sites, I recommend you use feature detection and like Modernizer, and make sure the content is readable when this particular feature is absent. So for now, I'm sorry to say I don't have many magic potions to give you for now, which is all I would say is continue using what you do. But I do recommend you read Nicole Sullivan's article on using media blocks, where she creates a simple media block that can be laid out in different formats with very minimal CSS. And it's very maintainable and efficient. And it would help you do most of the layout stuff that you have to deal with. And there is also a jQuery plugin called Isotope. How many of you have heard of Isotope? OK, a few people. So what Isotope does is, see. So you have this kind of jigsaw puzzle-like layout. And each of these elements is a content box. So this is definitely not possible with CSS available right now, so this needs JavaScript. And you can do align elements in this manner, and it's pretty cool to use, and it's a very good code that's written. So I recommend if you have complicated layouts and you want to do something complex, you could use Isotope for that. And Oops. Oh. Oops, I closed my presentation. That's great. Okay. So what I also wanted to mention is that we always want your feedback, and there is a mailing list where all these discussions on layout proposals are had, and it's at www.style. There's a link in the presentation which I will share later on. And well, the mailing list is voluminous because you will get at least like 400 emails a day, and most likely it's from people who have nothing else to do but write on these mailing lists. So you need to make sure that you filter it out and only focus on discussions that you are interested in. And if you have particular suggestions or bugs or an area of the spec that is unclear, just contribute on the mailing list and mention it. And even if you think the wording is not clear, you should jump on the mailing list and ask about that. And maybe you have some use cases that are not covered by these layout proposals. In that case, create those use cases and submit those use cases so that the working group can look at it and see if it could be accommodated with the current layout proposals, or maybe it needs a new proposal. Someone might be interested in creating a proposal for that. And also experiment with the builds that are out there with the different layout proposals. And then if you have bug reports, submit them to the browsers so that, and maybe it would help clarify the spec and make sure the proposals and the drafts themselves are more robust and can be implemented by more browsers more quickly. So it helps that you experiment with it. So that's all I have. And you have any questions? Anyone? Wow, it's so quiet here. Or is it all over the head? But no questions? Wow. OK, great. Thank you.